Oh, he's good. He's coming. Where does Jim? Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Kalispera σας. Welcome to the National Hellenic Museum. I'm going to just give everyone a moment to take their seats so we can start. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Mary Ann Kantouris. I have the privilege to serve as the executive director of the museum alongside our board of trustees, led by Chairman John P. Calamo Sr., and our distinguished advisors, and our dedicated museum staff. In fact, one of our vice chair is also with us this evening. I want to recognize Jim Logothetis. Thank you, Jim. It's always a pleasure working with you. And it's a pleasure to have so many of you in this room today. This museum was built to bring people together. It is a place where we call it the public square. We want to share and connect across generations and cultures. It's always a joy to see the museum come alive with people and conversation and debate. Our mission is very clearly to share Greek history, art, and culture, and the Greek American story, but to share it in ways that are relevant and meaningful, as I said, across generations and across cultures. We strive to make these connections between the past and the present, between Greece and America, and between the ancients, certainly, and our current time. We want this museum to always be this vibrant place where people gather to be inspired, to learn, to discover what unites us, and obviously what we have in common. Tonight, we're honored to join our friends at the Consulate General of Greece in Chicago to present the Arthur G. Nikelly Lecture for the Preservation of Hellenic Heritage and Culture as part of our World Philosophy Day celebration. And we are so grateful always to be working with Consul General Emmanuel Koubarakis and Consul Yoria Tasiopoulou. We've been working together now 4 years, and it's been such a joy. Anytime we come together for any kind of program, it's just always a pleasure. We're grateful to welcome Professor Proios, a leading scholar of Plato, for this special program. His lecture about what lessons can be learned from Plato and the Allegory of the Cave perfectly reflect the connections we make between the ancient world and the present moment. This evening is made possible through the generosity of Miss Eva Nikelly. She is right here in our front row. Eva, thank you for honoring us and trusting us with this legacy of your brother. This is named for her brother, Dr. Arthur G. Nikelly. He was a clinical psychologist at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, who is deeply devoted to Greek culture and the Greek diaspora and connecting generations together. So you can learn more about him in your handout as well. So again, Eva, we thank you. We're so fortunate to have you as one of our donors. We couldn't do this without you. And with all the donors, many of you who are in this room today, and everyone who's here to support this event. And now it is my honor to welcome our friend and partner, Consul General Emmanuel Koubarakis.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, αγαπητοί ομογενείς, καλησπέρα σας. It's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening as we celebrate World Philosophy Day, a day established by UNESCO to remind us that philosophy is not a luxury of the past. It's a living compass for societies seeking truth, justice, and freedom. For us Greeks, this day carries special resonance. Philosophy was born in our land, not merely as an academic pursuit, but as a civic duty, a call for citizens to question, to reason, and to participate in shaping a just and open society. For the Agora of Athens to every classroom and library around the world, Greek thought continues to illuminate the path of human inquiry. As Aristoteles wrote, education is the best provision for the journey of life. Philosophy is the foundation of that education, teaching us to think critically, to debate respectfully, and to defend the values that sustain free and democratic societies. And perhaps tonight, we are reminded that philosophy is also deeply human. It helps us understand ourselves, the people around us, and the world we hope to build for the next generation. At a time when the world faces polarization, disinformation, and attempts to undermine the principles of open dialogue, philosophy becomes not only relevant, but essential. It reminds us that democracy requires informed citizens, that freedom requires responsibility, and that truth must never be taken for granted. This evening, as we gather together with the National Hellenic Museum for the Arthur G. Nikelly Lecture, and I would like to thank the Executive Director and my very good friend Mariana Kudures, as well as the members of the board for this joint cultural initiative. We honor this heritage and reaffirm Greece's enduring contribution to global thought. It is also a special honor to welcome Ms. Nikelly, whose generosity and vision established this lecture in memory of your brother. We are deeply grateful for your presence tonight. We are also delighted to welcome Professor John Proios, who will offer us a fresh and thoughtful perspective inspired by Plato, brief, clear, and deeply relevant to our times. Thank you for being here tonight to celebrate the spirit of inquiry that unites us across cultures, generations, and continents. Σας ευχαριστώ.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I also have the privilege of working with this amazing, dedicated, and talented staff of people. We're a small, mighty team. Many of them are here today. Janet, Chris, Morgan, Larissa, and it's incredible to come to work every day and work with people who are very passionate about our mission and about sharing Greek culture. So now it's my pleasure to introduce one of those people, and that is our Director of Research and Content, Dr. Katie Kalaitis.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you, of course, Emmanuel and Georgia. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And of course, thank you, Ms. Nikelly, for making tonight possible. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, so I'm the only thing standing between you and Plato. Professor John D. Proios is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on ancient Greek philosophy, and his work has appeared in Ancient Philosophy, Classical Quarterly, and Philosopher's Imprint. He earned his PhD at Cornell in 2021 for a dissertation on the metaphysics of kinds and the search for the good in Plato. He's also the co-editor of a forthcoming anthology with Oxford University Press, Crafting Race in Plato and Aristotle. His talk tonight, entitled Escape and the Cave, Rethinking Plato for a New Age of Freedom, asks us to consider what Plato's timeless allegory might have to teach us in our present moment. This kind of dialogue across the ages is at the heart of the work we do at the National Hellenic Museum. Part of our firm belief that the richness of Greek history and culture, including ancient Greek philosophy, continues to have something important to say to all people in all times and all places. Your presence here tonight suggests you share this belief. And so whether this is your first time at the museum or your 100th, I would invite you to join us again, both in person and online, and continue to be part of the conversation. But first, without further ado, Professor John Proios.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Katie, for inviting me to do this. Thank you, everybody who's contributed to this. Thank you, Eva, for the, it's really nice to be doing this on the basis of the generosity of a fellow Greek islander. My grandparents are from the island of Ikaria, and I did want to mention that, I'm the second generation Greek American, and so my relationship to the Greek culture is more tenuous than it would have been otherwise, and as I've gotten older, it's gotten more and more tenuous. But it's spaces like these that help me keep that connection, and it was actually the Hellenic University Club of Philadelphia that gave me a scholarship that allowed me to move to start my PhD, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without that. So it was really the Greek-American community showing up for me in a way that I hadn't anticipated that made that possible. So I'm very grateful to that community and very honored to be here. Okay, so my talk today is basically the introduction to a book project that I've been working on, thinking about the idea of liberation in Plato, and the Allegory of the Cave is the kind of starting point. So what I'm going to say is supposed to set out a project. So I won't have a lot of super firm conclusions. I will raise some problems and point to some directions. And the rest of my project tries to carry that forward. But what I want to do tonight is kind of lay the groundwork for why thinking about Plato's idea of liberation as why that's a worthwhile project, in spite of what seem to be some fairly serious headwinds. And so what I'll try to do is lay out what some of those headwinds are and then how we might move forward. So you have a handout, or you should have a handout. It's just a list of texts. It's not necessary that you use the handout, but if you want to read along with the passages that I'm going to gesture to, then that's what the handout's for. So it's just a list of passages. Okay. Let me just set a quick timer here. So if you're familiar with anything in Plato, you're probably familiar with the Allegory of the Cave. So it comes in Book 7 of Plato's Republic, where he's imagining what does the just city look like, and he tells this story of the human condition. Socrates, who's the main speaker, asks his interlocutor Glaucon, who is incidentally Plato's brother, to imagine a community of human beings underground who are unable to turn around or move due to chains or bonds. So that's T1 on the handout. Socrates says, imagine these people who've been living in a cave-like dwelling their whole lives, and they can't turn around, but Thank you very much. They're bound, and there's a firelight behind them, and there are puppeteers who parade these puppets in front of the fire, and that casts a shadow in front of these people, and they can't move at all, so they think that the shadows are what Plato calls the true, to alethys, the true. So this is supposed to represent the lack of education on our nature. One prisoner in the allegory is sort of mysteriously freed. Socrates asks what would happen if he were released from his bonds and healed of his ignorance. That's T3. And what would happen if he were to escape to the outside and see the world as a whole. And as a result of the new knowledge that he gains by seeing that the world is not just this grotto, it's not just full of these shadows, but actually there's a sun. That's a really big important moment in the cave when he sees the sun for the first time. As a result of this new knowledge, the prisoner would prefer not to live in community with others, bound in the cave, but would do absolutely anything, even, and Plato quotes Homer here in the Odyssey, work the earth as a servant to another man without possessions. He would rather live that way as a peasant, rather than believe what the prisoners believe and live in the way that they do. And that's T4 on the handout. He would reject and pity the positions of power and honors that the prisoners assign on the basis of who is best able to remember and predict the shadows on the wall. In other words, because the escaped prisoner no longer believes that the true is just the shadows, but understands the shadows as a part of reality as a whole, life underground seems to be a miserable, pitiable existence. And the scene from the Odyssey that Plato is quoting is where Odysseus goes into the underworld and he finds Achilles and he says, Achilles, you must be treated as a king down here. Isn't that so great? And Achilles says, no, it's preferable to work the earth as a servant without possessions than to be even a king down here. So the idea is any form of life is superior to being dead and in the underworld. And Plato is saying in the Allegory of the Cave that enlightenment, any form of enlightenment is superior to ignorance, right? That's the parallel contrast. He's essentially saying that being ignorant is parallel to being in the underworld. It's like being dead. Okay, so whether as the subject of fierce scholarly debate, as an image to be adapted and appropriated, or as a provocative educational text, Plato's Cave has earned a substantial and lasting interest among his readers. It appears to tell this universal story of human bondage and emancipation, and it's powerfully expressed through Plato's skill at image making. But and it also has clear political undertones. So the shadow games in the cave in T4, they harken back to a passage in Book 6 of the Republic where Socrates says that the many, or the majority, are the greatest sophist because they use the power of the mob and the violence of the state to coerce private educators into calling wisdom the ability to remember, predict, and satisfy their moods, that is, the moods of the mob. So the mob is kind of like the puppeteers. But Plato's Socrates also gives his own official interpretation of the cave. He says that it's continuous with the theory of reality and human cognition that he's already developed, which has divided everything into what is available to thought or intelligence, so what you can think of, like numbers, and what's available to sensation, like this, right? Like the things that I can touch and see and taste. And he said those are two kind of levels of reality and two forms of cognition, perception on the one hand and thought on the other. And what he said is that this is what the cave is about. The prisoners bound underground, they're the life of the soul as it is lived through perception, and outside is the life of the soul as it is lived through thought. And so that's T5 on your handout, where Socrates gives this official interpretation. So the transformation in the soul that is represented by the allegory, so it's a dynamic image, right? The prisoner changes, he develops. This is supposed to represent the soul's education, or what Socrates will go on to call the turning of the soul from a day that is a kind of night to the true day. And that's T6. So to this extent, the cave is part of a pattern in Plato's thought. And this is a pattern that I label psychological liberation, the idea of the liberation of the soul. Socrates follows the cave with an argument that the psychological experience represented by the prisoner's escape corresponds to education in mathematics and philosophical dialectic. And so to this extent, the cave tells a story of human liberation, and that appears to be universal, but it gives a very specific take on what that liberation is. It's enlightenment. That's what liberation is. It's to become enlightened. I think that Plato often expresses this idea that the soul's liberation consists in its enlightenment, so not only in the Republic, but also in the Phaedo, the Meno, and the Theaetetus. These are other dialogues of Plato. The details can vary, but the basic idea is that the human soul is in a condition of bondage, usually because of its embodiment, but also somehow because of social and political conditions, and only philosophy can liberate it. So that tends to be how psychological liberation runs. Now, my interest here is both to articulate psychological liberation as a Platonic theory, so I want to be able to say what exactly is this idea that Plato has, and to try to make it intelligible within a broader frame of reference. For Plato is not the only person to have thought hard about the normative project of human liberation. Many social and political movements present their activities as aiming at liberation, and by extension, many social and political theorists investigate what this liberation means, and they try to contribute to it as a theorist can. By situating Plato in this broader landscape, what I want to show is that we can get into view certain criticisms of the conception of liberation as enlightenment, as well as why it seems so plausible that these apply to Plato's theory of psychological liberation. So in what follows, I'm going to start by articulating the idea of liberation as enlightenment in more detail and some critical alternatives to it. And then I'll turn to psychological liberation in Plato, and in particular his appropriation of slavery as a metaphor for the soul's condition without philosophy. And I'll use this as the basis for developing a criticism of psychological liberation. So the main problem, the basic idea, is that Plato simultaneously, on the one hand, appears to internalize the project of liberation. It's a project of self-cultivation. And this relies on the badness of slavery for the enslaved as a way to facilitate this internalization. So your soul is enslaved if it's not liberated, and that's a bad thing, so we agree slavery is a bad thing. And yet, on the other hand, he seems to naturalize the social condition of actually being an enslaved person. So there's a kind of tension in Plato's theory. And so what I want to do is get that tension on the table, and then briefly at the end, time permitting, I will try to sketch an alternative way of reading psychological liberation so that it's not about the internalization of the project of liberation, but is rather a certain conception of what philosophy is as a practice between people. So it's a social practice and not something that happens merely in your soul. Okay. So now I'm moving on. So that was part one. Now I'm moving on to part two. So I want to characterize this idea of liberation as enlightenment in more detail. So we've seen that in the Allegory of the Cave, Plato appears to depict human liberation as a matter of psychic enlightenment. The soul is freed by turning it around from the day-night of sensation to the true day, the realm of being, what is available to thought. And in the Phaedo, this is the dialogue I'm going to talk about now in more detail, in the Phaedo, he also characterizes the soul as in a condition of bondage, due in particular to its incarceration in a body, so it's embodiment, and its compulsion to function through the medium of the bodily organs, so that is to say, to perceive. So he thinks that the condition that we have as perceivers is a type of incarceration of our soul, which without the body would engage in pure thought. Philosophy does this, the project of philosophy is to liberate the soul from its embodiment and to get the soul to turn inwards and operate herself by herself through pure reasoning. So that's T7 and T8 on your handouts where Plato characterizes that. So by characterizing human liberation as the liberation of the soul, Plato anticipates and perhaps himself advances an understanding of freedom, bondage, and liberation as internal conditions of the person, and therefore the goal of emancipatory action as an epistemic and moral ideal. So we're unfree because we're ignorant, and the way to become free is to get knowledge or wisdom. And this conception of liberation as internal, especially as an internal enlightenment, is not an idea that is unique to Plato. It's well represented by the Stoic Epictetus. Epictetus was a Greek slave that was brought to Rome and then manumitted in Rome. And so he operated in a Roman culture, but he was himself Greek, and so he wrote in Greek. So according to Epictetus, he gives this contrast between manumission, or the freedom of a slave, and real freedom in his view. So on the one hand, Epictetus says that freedom as a psychological condition is completely separable from non-psychological circumstances. So in T9 on your handout, he asks, why does the slave want to be free? Well, it's because he thinks that by being free, he'll be happy. But Epictetus, as a Stoic, then argues what he finds is that he falls into a new kind of slavery once he's been manumitted. As he puts it, having nowhere to eat, he looks around for someone to flatter. So you become a slave to the appetites, and you have to do all kinds of morally corrupt things in order to pursue your appetites. And this is a kind of classic Stoic view. In the same section of the Discourses, he also says that not only is a manumitted slave not really free if his soul isn't in the right way, but also a Roman senator, even Caesar himself, without the right psychological disposition, is merely a, quote, slave in a purple-bordered robe. Right? And so actually a lot of this section of the Discourses is devoted to emphasizing that wealthy, powerful people in Rome who have political connections think that those political connections make them make them powerful and make them free, but what he's saying is that actually they're just as much a slave as the newly manumitted slave is, because they're all in a psychologically bad way. Okay, so there's this kind of divorce then between real freedom on the one hand, which is a psychological condition, and the social and political economic condition that one finds oneself in, and they're completely separable. And that's why a slave and Caesar can both be a psychological slave. And by contrast, an actually enslaved person could be psychologically free. Okay, so a clear alternative to this idea can be found in Angela Davis's reading of Frederick Douglass's story of slavery and emancipation. So this is Frederick Douglass's first narrative of his life, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. So this is T10 on your handout, and there's a little quote from Douglass there as well. So Davis points out that Douglass identifies education and the new development of knowledge, in particular literacy, as essential to his escape from slavery. So Douglass learns to read and gains a new critical awareness of his situation. And this is really pronounced in Douglass's own telling. But Davis argues Douglass's knowledge is only a kind of negative enlightenment, through which he becomes aware of how his life is not what it could be. So in Douglass's own words, and this is in the parenthesis below T10, in Douglass's own words, learning to read enabled me to utter my thoughts. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. And so that's Douglass. And in Davis's interpretation of this, She argues that the knowledge of Douglas's knowledge of his own condition, enabled by literacy, is valuable to the extent that it allows him to become aware of himself as alienated from another way of living, which he can grasp by contrast to his enslavement, and because of that contrast, identify as freedom. So he now knows what a bad way he's in, and he can, because of like a critique of that way of being, can see what freedom would mean, because it would mean not living like this. But this means, as she puts it, that enlightenment does not bring happiness. This is what I've underlined in the passage. Enlightenment does not bring happiness, nor does it bring real freedom. It brings desolation, misery, i.e., or that is, as long as the slave does not see a concrete path out of his enslavement. So Douglas's liberation does not consist in enlightenment. So this is a clear alternative to Epictetus, who thought that liberation is the enlightenment of the soul, and maybe to Plato. But still, enlightenment plays an important role in liberation, because Douglas's liberatory project it becomes intelligible to him once he is aware of it, once he's conscious of his own situation as an oppression. So this is basically to say that enlightenment can play this important role in liberation, but there's a difference in where you locate it in the idea of what it means to free a human being. Is it becoming aware of one's own situation, right? Or is that very active enlightenment the thing that makes you free, right? And we can see that there's two contrasting views here. Okay, so I want to draw out this contrast because, in particular, there's a worry from those who, like Davis, see the project of human liberation as outstripping the life of the mind or the soul, that the view of liberation as enlightenment is problematic. This is expressed in a recent paper by the social epistemologists Christy Dotson and S.G. Sertler regarding, as they put it, quote, a potential propensity to intellectualize social transformation so that one might assume that enlightenment is real freedom. But what exactly, so they're concerned with intellectualizing social transformation, right? But why? What's exactly the concern? I want to suggest that there's at least two problems that they plausibly could have in view. So the first is expressed in Marx and Engels' critique of left Hegelianism. So the left, this is kind of like inter-German philosophy wars to a certain extent, so forgive me. But the left Hegelians that Marx is trying to distinguish himself from, they maintain that if we could just think better, we could liberate society, right? So if we could just stop being deluded about what we think a human being is or what we think God is, then we could liberate society that way, right? And Marx and Engels mock this in the preface to the German Ideology. And the reason that they mock it is expressed later in the same text, where the idea is that this focus on thinking better leaves untouched what Marx and Engels believe to be the real causes of social conditions, namely economic forces and the relations we form around them. And so the turn inward then is a kind of quietism, or it encourages a kind of doing nothing about your social condition. It disencourages engagement from the social world and the social conditions like chattel slavery, or in their view, wage labor, that would need to be overcome for real liberation to come about. And so that's T12 on the handout, both passages, where they say that to achieve real liberation in the real world and by applying real means requires things like the steam engine and the mule and the spinning jenny, improved agriculture, adequate food and drink, housing, clothing, right, so you need, this is what the process of liberation involves, is the provision of those kinds of material conditions. That's what Marx and Engels think. And the left Hegelians are, by internalizing the project of freedom, they're distracting from that work, right? So Plato has been read as an internalist about freedom in precisely this sense. The influential Harvard historian Orlando Patterson reads Plato precisely this way, that basically, as he puts it in T13, one of Plato's really important achievements was to shift the focus of nearly all major subsequent thinkers down to the 18th century towards the idea that the inner world is not only superior to the outer, but is ultimately the only true world. And so people end up fighting about the freedom of the inner world and what that means. Okay, so one type of problem with this internalization view is that it's quietist, or it encourages disengagement with social reality. There's another type of problem, though, that I want to suggest, and I think it's more pernicious and therefore more damning. So more than encouraging disengagement, it could in fact justify real forms of unfreedom, such as indeed chattel slavery. So this move is frequently associated with the slavery metaphor in early Christian texts and how they coexisted for early Christian authors with at best a quietist attitude towards slavery, and at worst a full-throated endorsement of its justice. There's a recent scholar at Princeton, Tony Alimi, who's published a really nice book on Augustine, St. Augustine, and his attitudes towards slavery and how it's compatible with his Christianity, and in fact may grow, in some sense, grow out of it. Such a move continued in the era of transatlantic slavery. I'm happy to say more about that. It's also worth pointing out that the flip side is also true. So there's also abolitionists who appealed to Christian notions of the innate freedom of the soul in order to argue against slavery. Bartolomé Las Casas famously argued against the enslavement of the indigenous Americans on the grounds that they were, as human beings and as potential Christians, they were endowed with human souls, right? So it can cut in the other direction too. And ultimately, what I want to say is that the sort of metaphysics doesn't do the normative work for you. You have to just, it's not really, I think the sort of debate about whether we go inside or not is kind of missing the point to a certain extent. But that's, but none of that is to distract from the way that internalization can be used as a justification for actual forms of unfreedom, and slavery is a kind of like illustrative case. Okay, so these are two criticisms of the internal move. This second criticism has in fact been advanced as a criticism of Plato's Allegory of the Cave by the political philosopher Charles Mills. So Mills thinks that the cave is a kind of illustration of this idea that he calls cognitive liberation, where cognitive liberation is something that revolutionary movements need to engage in. It's a kind of consciousness raising. And so he thinks that this is a real phenomenon, and Plato's Allegory of the Cave represents it to a certain extent, but in a highly distorted way. So as Mills puts it, the cave is a conservative vision of cognitive liberation, whereas unlike genuinely liberatory projects, the cave grants cognitive liberation exclusively to a political elite, the philosopher rulers, and it uses an understanding of liberation as internal enlightenment to justify the perpetual rule of that elite over the cognitively impoverished and disenfranchised masses. It's a little bit hard to make this point without talking more about the political structure of the Republic itself, but basically Mills is thinking that in the Republic, society is supposed to be divided into these three classes, and the philosophers are supposed to be the rulers that have all the political power. And what justifies this is that they have knowledge. Because they have knowledge, they'll be good and beneficial rulers. And so Mills's critique is kind of not taking Plato's own view on its own terms. So Plato thinks that this is to the benefit of everybody in society, and essentially he thinks there's a benign form of elite rule. Beneficial form of elite rule, and Mills is basically just saying, no, there's no such thing as a beneficial form of elite rule, and so all this business of the cave is really just about justifying the rule of an intellectual elite over everybody else, right? That's Mills' criticism. Yeah, and so for this reason, he thinks that the liberation of the Platonic soul is no liberation at all. It's it's liberation in the sense that the bank where I get my money is the bank where I sit by the river, right? There's just two different, same word, two fundamentally different meanings. Before I move on to a more focused discussion of Plato, I want to note that the cave had a much more positive reception by none other than Huey Newton, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party. So in his autobiography, Newton describes, so his engagement with Plato is really interesting, actually. He taught himself how to read by reading The Republic over and over again. And he's clearly very influenced by the model of Socrates and conceives of himself as a kind of a Socratic for the 20th century. But the thing I want to put my finger on is that he describes sharing the cave in particular with, as he puts it, street brothers and dudes on the block, who like him saw the cave as, quote, very appropriate to our own situation. We too were prisoners and needed to be liberated in order to distinguish between truth and the falsehoods imposed upon us. So for Newton, the cave does capture that first step in revolutionary practice. It's the step of becoming aware of one's own situation as an oppression, and therefore imagining the condition of freedom to be realized through collective shared struggle. And Mill's interpretation of the cave implies that Newton has just got it wrong. Mills thinks that the cave is just a vehicle for elitism, and it's not really about oppression at all. So I hope that I have more to say about this kind of like competing, dueling readings of the cave and everything I was just saying. But what I'm trying to do is just motivate the question of how to situate Plato's account of psychological liberation within a broader dialectical space, right? Like it's actually an important question, what the cave is trying to say about human liberation, and there are different options, and they look very different from each other, and they have very different kinds of recommendations about what we should do now. So what I want to do now is try to actually develop the reading that Plato is like Epictetus, that he thinks that freedom is an internal condition of the soul, completely divorceable from one's external social conditions. And then what I'm going to try to do at the end is actually show why that reading is a part of the story, but not the whole story. Yeah. Okay. So now I'm moving on to the third section, which focuses back on the Phaedo and Plato's appropriation of slavery as a metaphor or analogy for the soul's condition. So the Phaedo, it's a great dialogue if you haven't read it. Socrates' last hours in prison before he drinks the hemlock and is executed. It's a beautiful dialogue with a lot of really interesting arguments. And it's a natural place to dig more deeply into Plato's account of psychological liberation because it's probably the most extensive discussion of psychological liberation as such in Plato's dialogues. Socrates argues at length that the goal of philosophy is to liberate the soul from the body, right? And so in part he's arguing that philosophy is preparation for death, and death is the separation of the soul from the body, and what philosophers try to do is separate their souls from their bodies as far as possible, and so they should welcome death. Death is not a bad thing for a philosopher. So T7 and T8 gave you a sense of this. T16 through T19 are also just all passages where Socrates says something to this effect. So as T16 puts it, the body is a sort of prison for the soul. His reasoning here is that the body is an impediment to the soul's pursuit of wisdom. It's in the nature of the soul to grasp cognitively, so with the rational thought, what's clear, true, and precise, and it's only the imposition of the body on the soul's activities that prevents this from obtaining. He often talks about the body as if it's a kind of cloak or covering that blocks the soul's, it's like looking at the world through a veil or something like that. That's how he thinks of the relationship between the soul and the body. And so the goal then of philosophy is to get the soul to operate without the body, but herself by herself. Aftikath aftin. It has purely intellectual cognition or noesis of non-sensible, intelligible reality by reasoning as separately as possible from the body. Okay, so that's the picture of philosophy and the relationship between the soul and the body in the Phaedo. What I want to highlight is that there's a certain rhetorical strategy that's going on here that can sort of lie beneath the surface, but is really important to the way that the argument works. It hinges on something that is in some ways really obvious. So Socrates is trying to say something controversial. He's not only trying to show that the soul is in a bad way by being in the body, already a controversial thing to think, but that this condition, this being in a bad way, is a type of bondage, right? It's a type of unfreedom. And that the specific practice of philosophy can fix things, and that as a result, to practice philosophy is to free the soul. That's the argument. But that's really controversial, and that's not an ordinary thing for an ancient Athenian to say to another ancient Athenian, right? So he has to find a way to make this intelligible to his interlocutors. And so what he does is he appeals to the conceptual resources of actual non-metaphorical conditions of bondage. So for example, while he is himself literally incarcerated as he awaits, he's in prison, he's got prison guards, he extends literal incarceration metaphorically to the soul-body relation. The soul is in the body as a sort of cage, right? That was T16. It may be freed from the body as if from bonds, that's T17, and it's compelled to investigate the body as if through a cage, that's T8. So a sort of prison, as if from bonds, as if through a cage. The language of simile here, the as if, underscores that Socrates does not take for granted our ability to conceptualize the relationship between the body and the soul that he's trying to articulate. He offers us and his interlocutors tools. We're supposed to think of the relationship between the soul and the body as the relation of somebody who's incarcerated to that which incarcerates them, or the relationship of in other words, the relationship of the prisoner to the enclosure or the bonds that keeps them enclosed. So that's the first thing that he appeals to is incarceration. The second thing that he appeals to is slavery. So in T18, he says, nature, or I think is that T18 or, yeah, T18. Nature orders one to be enslaved and ruled, and the other to rule and master. So that is to say that the body is the natural slave of the soul, and the soul is the natural master of the body. But what happens is that the relationship gets inverted, and the body masters the soul instead, and this is bad. As he describes in T19, bodily passions may allow the soul to master the body. Pleasure can overcome the intemperate person such that they're ruled and controlled by their pleasures, right? So this language can only be metaphorical. It's a way of conceptually structuring our understanding of the relationship between the soul and the body, but it doesn't claim that the soul is literally a master or literally a slave, right? It's a metaphor. This is also evident in the choice of narrator and title character of the Phaedo. So Phaedo was a real historical person, really knew Socrates, and according to one of the sources, Diogenes Laertius, Phaedo was himself a manumitted slave, possibly ransomed by Socrates from a form of sexual slavery. So, having a manumitted slave tell the story of Socrates accounting for the soul's emancipation from the body, right? I mean, Plato is like this clear literary device. So what I want to point out is that appropriating these real forms of unfreedom, slavery and incarceration, to structure our understanding of the soul's relationship to the body and the significance of philosophy, but by doing this, Socrates implicitly puts conceptual and normative distance from the forms of bondage and liberation that he's trying to articulate, and the things that interest him, and actual bondage and liberation, so the things that he's using as metaphors. He puts a kind of distance between those things and the project that he's interested in as a philosopher. So for instance, this is why he is literally incarcerated, yet he speaks of how a philosopher such as himself frees his soul through intellectual practices, and he explicitly argues against a prison break. So he's not interested in breaking out of prison. He thinks that would be anti-philosophical. And so you can see that liberating the soul from its prison is completely separable from liberating Socrates from his the prison of his, beyond his body, right? So in this respect, to articulate psychological liberation, Socrates extracts the original social meaning from these concepts. This also applies to the case of slavery, and in particular, what he does is he preserves the normative perspective that the slaveholder, as opposed to the enslaved, has on slavery. So in the case that I was just discussing, where the soul is the natural master of the body, but things get messed up, the argument appears to rely on the assumption that slavery is actually good and beneficial when it reflects a genuine inequality. Right? Earlier in the dialogue, he's argued that we are slaves to the gods and we ought to be good slaves to them. Right? So he thinks when there's a genuine inequality, master-slave relationships are legitimate and should be preserved. Right. So the soul's right, and that's why the soul's manumission is justified. So thus, Socrates conceives of the soul's liberation only by internalizing the master-slave relation as a relationship between the soul and the body, and assuming the legitimacy of the master's claim to enslave. And here Plato joins a broader literary tradition in the ancient Greek world, in which virtue is presented as a kind of self-mastery over certain psychological phenomena, usually pleasure. So I just listed some of the passages here from Xenophon, Gorgias, Aristotle. This is a kind of common move. So I think at this point we can see why someone might worry that Plato is internalizing freedom and bondage in a way that will undermine liberatory social projects. By internalizing liberation to human psychology, Plato skirts the social significance that would otherwise ground a confrontation with the most obvious forms of human bondage, such as actual slavery. This is why he can both passionately advocate for philosophy as the practice of liberating the soul from its bondage while simultaneously failing to contest the social relationships of domination, indeed while simultaneously affirming the legitimacy of master-slave relationships. Now, to be clear, it's possible, it's perfectly possible, it's open to Plato, to engage in this kind of confrontation with slavery and incarceration in other parts of his philosophical theories. Especially, this is what you expect a theory of justice to do, right? Okay, yes, Socrates can make these moves here, but then you do a theory of justice which says that slavery is unjust and therefore should be abolished, right? Totally open to Plato to do this. But it's an empirical issue whether he really does, and as far as I'm aware, in no text does he ever contest slavery on any grounds. In fact, his political theory seems to legitimize it. In The Statesman, so there's a number of political Platonic dialogues. The Statesman is one of them. I've given you just some excerpts on T20. So in The Statesman, slaves are one of the real classes or parts of the city coordinated by the science of statecraft. So he thinks of slaves as like a discrete part of the city, like the craftsman, or the maker of ships, or the generals, or the rhetors, right? These are different like social roles or occupations, and he thinks slavery is one of them, and the job of statecraft is to kind of coordinate all these things with each other. And in fact, further beyond that, he argues that statecraft is even supposed to use enslavement as part of the construction of the social fabric. Even more than this, in the Laws, the last dialogue Plato ever wrote, according to Aristotle, it was still on the wax, which meant it was an unfinished document. In the Laws, the Athenian stranger, who's the main speaker, he explicitly recognizes that nobody willingly accepts slavery. Nobody willingly accepts slavery, and this is why he argues slave revolts are really common. And so, in the society that he's designing with his interlocutors, the colony of Magnesia, which was theoretically supposed to be in Crete, he argues that it would be best to enslave people from disparate lands who speak different languages so as to undermine the possibility of organized slave rebellions. So if they can't talk to each other, they can't figure out how to get out of this condition. But this is recognizing that nobody wants to be a slave, right? Right, and so this is what I was saying at the beginning, that Socrates' appropriation of slavery as a metaphor for the soul's condition must assume the badness of slavery for the enslaved, and yet, as I've argued, he also seems to presuppose the legitimacy of actual slavery outside of the soul-body relationship. Okay, so, right, I think there's more to say about what's problematic about that, but in the last 5-10 minutes here, I want to say something about where we go from here. If this is, like, given this critique of Plato, where do we go from here? So, I want to emphasize that my goal here is not simply to hold Plato to a contemporary normative standard and point out his shortcomings. Of course, Plato lived in a society where slavery was commonplace. He himself owned slaves, and it was extremely common for people in his social position to do so. That he takes up the perspective of the slaveholder in his philosophical arguments is in no way surprising. It would be extremely surprising if he didn't do that, right? So his views about gender, for instance, that there should be an equality of men and women in the division of labor, that's really surprising that he says that, right? But he doesn't say anything that's like that about slavery. But my goal here is not just to point that out, because that's uninteresting, right? Of course he thought that. It's uninteresting that he thought that. Rather, my goal is to evaluate Plato's conception of liberation as a normative ideal, that is, as something that could shape the way that we now think about and work towards the collective emancipation of human beings. I take it that that is an unfinished project. After all, Plato's own conception of dialectic, that is the practice of the philosopher, dialectic or dialektike, which Plato is appropriating from the ordinary word of just to have a conversation, his own conception of dialectic demands this kind of exacting scrutiny. According to the Republic, the dialectical philosopher is supposed to be able to give an account, a logos, of what a thing is, which survives every scrutiny or attempted refutation. Refutation is the thing that Socrates is famous for, scrutinizing people, questioning their claims to knowledge. The dialectical philosopher is supposed to be able to give accounts that survive the most demanding forms of refutation. And that's what I'm trying to do now. I'm trying to subject his account of psychological liberation to refutation and to see if it survives. And so far, I've taken myself to show that in order for him to defend psychological liberation as liberation, Plato must recognize certain forms of unfreedom in the social world. Yet the resulting theory of the soul's internal project of becoming free does not require contesting these forms of unfreedom in the social world. And it may even naturalize them as unobjectionable. And that just looks to me like a contradiction. It's the kind of thing that Socrates identifies in people's arguments. Okay, but in the spirit of Socratic truth-seeking, I also do not want to stop when one line of reasoning seems to condemn a possible account of what something is. It is, in fact, often Socrates' place in the dialogues to offer his interlocutors a lifeline, so to speak, and to follow it with them to see if it helps their argument. And so that's what I want to do now in relation to Plato's account of psychological liberation. By doing so, I think we can see the appeal of a different, non-internal notion of liberation through philosophy that's also available to Plato. And that's also compatible with his idea that liberation is, at least in part, the liberation of the soul. So to this end, I want to consider a famous episode in Plato's Meno. Another fantastic dialogue that Meno and the Phaedo are the two dialogues that I always teach Intro to Ancient Philosophy with. They're great introduction to Socrates and the philosophy of Plato. So here, Meno, who's the main sort of interlocutor with Socrates, is trying to define what virtue is, what arete is. And he hasn't been able to do it. And this is very frustrating to him because he says that he's often been able to give speeches in front of many people saying what virtue is, and he thinks he gives good accounts and people like what he has to say. And of course, this is a critique of him and saying that actually he didn't know what he was doing. And Socrates has intervened when Meno has kind of been ready to give up. And Socrates says, no, you shouldn't give up. Look, I'll show you. It's possible to make progress in inquiry even when you don't know what it is you're trying to even when you don't have the knowledge of the thing you're inquiring into already. And how am I going to do that? Socrates asks Meno to call one of his nameless slaves in his entourage forth to engage in a conversation with Socrates. And what Socrates does is he talks with this slave and gets him to learn a new geometrical truth about how to double the area of the 4-foot square, even though no one had ever taught him geometry. And he uses this as an illustration that it's possible to gain knowledge, right? So the slave is capable of learning. That's the important point. And Socrates draws clear juxtaposition between the slave and Meno, where he says, look, Meno, the slave is in exactly the condition that you were in, and look, he can learn, so can you, right? And so many elements of this text are plausibly subversive when it comes to the reality of slavery and freedom. So for instance, while Meno is free in the social sense, he's rich, handsome, well-born, it's Ganaios, and a known military leader, and this is in Xenophon's report of Meno too. He's really good-looking, rich, also reported as a terrible person who died young because he cheated too many people and it came back to bite him. So he's got all these sort of traits of a powerful person in the society, and yet he's intellectually incompetent, right? By contrast, his enslaved attendant succeeds in the task that Meno professes to be unable to complete. And so the dialogue illustrates that while an actually enslaved person has a capacity for the kind of psychological progress that in the Phaedo Socrates associates with liberation, right? So he inquires into intelligible abstract entities and progresses towards knowledge. A free and powerful person is psychologically enslaved, right? Unable to make that same kind of progress, or in principle able but refuses, and for that reason is unable. So the basic idea then is that there's a kind of inversion of the social roles, right? And so a number of scholars have recognized this. I put some quotes from them on the handout where they say that in the sort of true Platonic hierarchy, the slave would be on top and Meno would be on the bottom, right? So there's a kind of undermining of the existing social relationships. I think that actually we can go even further than this, though. It's not just social role inversion. A telling passage comes after this demonstration. This is the very last thing on your handout, where Socrates, Meno has wanted to know whether virtue is teachable, and he keeps asking whether virtue is teachable, and Socrates keeps saying, you have to inquire into what virtue is before you can know whether it's teachable. And at this point in the dialogue, Meno kind of reverts to that, and Socrates gets really annoyed with him, and he says, well, Meno, if I were in charge, not only of myself but also of you, we would not investigate whether virtue is teachable or not until we first found out whatever it is. But since you don't even try to rule yourself in order that you may be free, but instead try to rule over me and in fact do, I will concede to you. So I think that this is an important passage because what it does is it suggests that philosophical conversation carried out in the right way constitutes a certain social form or social practice. So we see this only in the negative, insofar as Meno is throwing things off. But what we see is that there are relations of ruling and being ruled embodied in a philosophical conversation, and that one can try to be free through a philosophical conversation. Now, Meno has a different conception of freedom, and I'm happy to talk about what Plato really thinks the freedom that's realized through philosophical conversation might be. But I take it that this passage suggests that the philosophical practice itself is the vehicle for liberation. Right, and so if Plato takes this route, then he would not only commit to rejecting existing social relations as expressions of freedom and bondage, but he would also insist on alternative social relations, those that obtain in the kind of social context that allows for psychological liberation, that is, an appropriate philosophical conversation. So another way to put this is what I'm saying is that Plato's political theory is philosophy. It's, you do philosophy. That's how you need to reorganize social relations. You need to all become philosophers. That's the only prospect of liberation. Right, so I think this is a novel and more promising way of understanding the liberatory practice of philosophy. It liberates not only because of what it does to your soul, but because of how it reshapes your relationships with others and facilitates new shared practices. And to be sure, in my own reading of Plato, so I said this is the beginning of a project, so at the end of the project, I still think that Plato is reifying slavery in a certain way, because he thinks that the material conditions necessary for philosophy, in particular leisure, are enabled by the labor of the enslaved. And this is just something Plato thinks. And I think this is a problem for his theory that he'll have to confront. But I still think that he and we are on better footing by rejecting the idea that freedom is an internal achievement only, and by embracing the idea that freedom is a social condition realized through cooperation with others, and that perhaps indeed philosophy could itself be the social project through which we seek that freedom. Right? So that's all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for an incredibly stimulating talk. And just as I kind of look out in the audience, I think it's very obvious that Plato can bring people together. The sort of diversity of the crowd we get when we talk about ancient philosophy is really impressive to me. Whether that's people, and of the people you quoted in your talk, right? So whether that's, Greek American kids like he and I who kind of find our way back to the Greeks, or Angela Davis and Huey P. Newton and Frederick Douglass. I think that really speaks to the relevance of this tradition across time and for people, which is really at the heart of the work we do here, and why I keep coming back to work. I think is that I really do believe that there is something in here that is for everyone, and that speaks across time, these issues of freedom and liberation that are so important. So I know people have questions. So we're going to ask you, this is being recorded. So if you would be so kind as to come to that microphone to ask your questions, the gentleman who is doing the recording would much appreciate it. However, if you can't stand, if you raise your hand, my colleague Janet Kashuba and my colleague Chris Norton have microphones. I will give Janet back her microphone. Have microphones and can bring the microphone to you. But if you are able to come to the microphone, go ahead and do that. So are there questions? We'll give people a moment. Is anyone here? Oh, we do have a question.
Are you sure? Okay. For fear of veering off your topic just slightly, but not that much, oftentimes another object that sort of gets this cave metaphor is a woman's womb. And that would add another layer onto this idea of liberation, in that women can't escape that because women have wombs, at least, in the ancient context, right, that would be what defined a woman, someone with a womb, and they wouldn't be able to escape that that level of imprisonment, at least not from the body. And so I'd love to know how that would work into some of these theories and sort of what you were talking about. Again, a little bit off topic, but not really that much.
Oh, thank you so much. This is a great question. I mean, I guess we can ask, like, what did Plato think and what is sort of implied by the theory? And I mean, on the one hand, what he thought is that, in fact, the difference between women is a mere biological between women and men is a mere biological, it's a difference in reproductive capacity. And that is irrelevant to how jobs ought to be assigned. This is the argument that he gives in the Republic. And one of those jobs is philosopher ruler. So, there's philosopher kings and there's philosopher queens, and they're supposed to do identical jobs, right? So from the perspective of the cave, it seems like Plato thinks that women are just as capable of the liberation of the soul as men. That's the argument that we get. Yeah, I really like the idea that the cave is like a metaphor or is an image that sort of like belongs to the same family of images as like a metaphor for the womb. Because I think that there's the way that he characterizes the soul's relationship to the body is very much kind of like the body is the problem, right? And you might worry that leads to a kind of hatred of the body in a way that is historically often linked with misogyny, right? And so this has been raised, objection has been raised to me before. And I think that what Plato's view is not that the body should be an object of hatred, but that it is an impediment, and that the project of liberation involves minimizing its ability to be an impediment, right? And I guess I see that as compatible with what he says in the Republic, because part of the social program, there's a kind of socialized child care program that gets advanced in the Republic where, like breastfeeding becomes a socialized project so that the women who are engaged in the military and in ruling don't have to spend too much time away from their jobs, right? So he seems to think that like we need to minimize the body's ability to interfere with the activity of the soul, and he applies this to sexual difference as well, right? Or difference in reproductive organ. Yeah. Thank you.
As a philosopher, what is your take on the expression, ignorance is bliss?
Well, I think Plato would think that ignorance can be pleasant, but and maybe that's what bliss means, but that pleasure is not real happiness, right? Happiness is eudaimonia. It's living a good life, right? And so I think he thinks that it's not possible to live a good life in a condition of ignorance unless somebody who knows guides your life for you. And that's the political setup of the Republic, is the rulers who know, they guide the lives of the ignorant for them so that their lives are as good as possible. But you need knowledge, right? That's a kind of like core Platonic and Socratic idea, is that all human value comes from knowledge. And so ignorance, I think they would reject the view that ignorance is bliss. And I think I would reject the view that ignorance is bliss too. Right? It's philosophia, right? It's the pursuit of wisdom, love of wisdom.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. So if we bring the discussion to the age of AI, would you consider, for the discussion of the cave, at the age of the AI, would you consider, the echo chambers, for instance, as new forms of the cave? And also AI products as the shadows on the wall? Or would you consider that AI actually will liberate us, will find us more time, will give us more money to philosophize?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I don't know. I think, if slavery can be abolished with the spinning, what Marx and Engels say? Slavery can't be abolished with the steam engine and the mule and the spinning jenny, right? You need technological improvement in order to be able to provide people with adequate resources so that they can do the things that actually make life matter, right? I think Plato absolutely thinks this. He thinks this is about philosophy, right? Philosophers in the Republic are, I was just talking about the child care with women, right? That's part of the story. And also, in general, philosophers are not supposed to own any private property because Plato thinks this is like corrupting, but they are paid what they need for survival by the people that they rule over. And the reason that they're paid, the reason that there's a kind of distributive tax that is then like given to the philosophers as their wage, is so that they have the leisure to engage in philosophy and political affairs, right? And so there's this real acknowledgement that you need the material conditions for people to do the things that are, what life is about, whether that's in doing philosophy or engaging in politics, right? I think Plato and Aristotle are they prioritize philosophy, but they kind of put politics in second place there. And that was obviously very important in the Greek democracy, the Athenian democracy. Now, with the specific question of AI, I don't know that, I think that there's a worry about the tool a tool is a tool for something, and there's a worry about the tool becoming the end in itself. And when resources get poured into the maintenance of a tool, and we kind of become obsessed about the tool, there is a kind of, a classic kind of critique of that as it's the opposite of liberation, right? It's making ourselves subordinate to our own instruments, as opposed to seeing those instruments as instruments for our free time, right? I like that idea. I think that idea is kind of available to Plato and he recognizes it in various ways. And I do think that when I was a student, the first time I read the Allegory of the Cave, one of the other students in class was like, "Oh, the cave is TV." This was back when not everybody had internet, So there's a lot of it's not, we're not in the AI age at that point. But I do think that there's a really natural connection with cultural media as the kinds of things that the cave represents. Another natural connection to make in the Republic is that the puppeteers, I do think that they're the many, they're the democratic masses, but also in some sense, Plato also thinks they're the poets. They're the people who give us our stories about what matters and what life is like. And so I think to me, that's, the idea of a kind of cultural media is represented in Plato through the poets, and they too are supposed to be agents of our metaphorical enslavement. Yeah, thank you.
You touched upon the question that I came up here with your last answer. The question that I have is, with AI and with social media, aren't we creating a bunch of different caves that certain people go in and they could only see the shadows that are projected in that particular cave? And my question is, how do we collectively, or using philosophy as a tool, escape those and serve in a society where we can actually think and create and not fall a trap into the cave again? So that's more for the philosophers to deal with.
Thank you. Thank you. Great question. I don't know. I've made my students start writing things by hand again, and that's my answer. No, I think. More seriously. I think part of my answer is the kind of like treating the tool as the end in itself, and what is the tool supposed to serve. But I think that what is the idea of a kind of like the kinds of, I take it that the kinds of scenarios you're describing are scenarios where people kind of become part of some kind of social practice online, and there are certain kinds of like things that are treated as good or bad within that social practice according to parameters that are set up within, it's like a game, right? And you kind of lose sight of what's going on outside of the game, and you start to treat the game as reality. Right? And I take it that this is exactly what Plato is saying the escaped prisoner thinks about the people in the cave who have these positions of power that they allot to each other on the basis of who can remember and guess the shadows, which is to say, who can say the right thing in front of the democratic masses, whether that's in the theater or in the assembly or in the law court. It's a game of predicting responses, rather than thinking about what are those responses for? What's their, what is it that all of this is sort of aimed at? And I think that that's what the perspective of the prisoner is supposed to have, is he's supposed to look down and see that actually everything these people are doing is part of a larger whole, and they don't really understand that the shadows are something that are real, but they're a mirror image of the things that are really real, namely the things outside the cave, right? So I mean that I don't have like a practical answer to your question other than to say that I think the idea of not we engage in all kinds of social practices where we are, we're the kinds of creatures. I mean, this actually maybe does go to another thing Plato says. We're the kinds of creatures who really we learn how to get what we think is beneficial, and we become incentivized to pursue that thing that we think is beneficial. But what Plato is saying is like, why do you think that thing is beneficial? And actually there's a right or wrong answer to whether or not it's beneficial. And you should stop thinking about whether you're motivated to pursue it, because as a bodily kind of creature, you are motivated to pursue things that give you pleasure, right? We should stop thinking about whether you're motivated to pursue it and whether it appears good or whether it should appear good to you. And that, I think, takes you into sort of a more what is good for a human being kind of perspective. And I think that's what Plato is trying to get us to think about.
I could, but I won't. I'm very curious to know as to how philosophy and religion merge, because they are both the same area in the library, and I've been wondering about that a while. And because I'm a preacher, I'm very interested as to why the church accepted Platonic thinking and made it part of their theological system, which I do not agree with because he was not a Christian. Mm-hmm. And I believe in sticking with the truth. I'm very stickler about that. That's another thing. So, do you think philosophy is man's way of trying to understand why he's here? And I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. Let me see. I don't know. I think that I can see an answer that Plato, maybe Aristotle would give. They would just say that like religion is a sort of like grasping after something that really is true, which is that there's a rational order to the cosmos as a whole, and we are a part of that cosmos, and therefore we reflect that rational order, and our idea of the gods is just the idea of like supremely rational beings that embody the perfection of the world more than anything else. I mean, that is the kind of classic Aristotelian and many other ancient philosophical schools way of answering that question of the relationship between religion and philosophy, even though popular religion often gets things really wrong. Like this is something Plato is super on about in the Republic, is that the poets tell us all of these misleading stories about the gods, that they fight with each other, that they do unjust things, right? But gods can only do good things. Anyway, so I think that there's a kind of, that's the kind of ancient Greek answer, ancient Greek philosophical answer, I think. There's another one that's kind of in the vicinity, which I think is a very Aristotelian answer, which is that it's not a question of why we're here, but a question of why should I do anything that I do? What is the reason for any action? And there has to be a kind of overall structure that justifies my doing anything at all. Divine authority is one way to answer that question. Why should I do anything at all, right? But I think Aristotle is really interested in just appreciating that for action of any kind, for me to pick up the pen, to speak, to undertake longer term projects, for me to do any of those kinds of things, there has to be a kind of ultimate goal to all of it, and everything else has to kind of flow from that, normatively speaking. And I mean, Aristotle, and I think Plato's answer too, is that that thing is, at least Aristotle's answer is that thing is happiness. That's eudaimonia, living well. And that's compatible with Aristotle, for Aristotle, with thinking also that the gods are perfect embodiments of the rational order of the cosmos. So it's not a kind of like atheist perspective. Yeah, that's what I can think of right now. Thank you for your question.
Hi, I was wondering if we accept that philosophical practice itself can become a vehicle for liberation, wouldn't that also mean that philosophical practice inadvertently become an impediment to collective liberation, because there's always going to be that vicious cycle of knowing or not knowing enough. Some people who will be above others, so it will create some form of inequality that it's hard to assess.
Sorry, is the inequality of knowing and not knowing? Is
Yeah.
that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your question. I mean, I'm really worried about this problem in Plato's own theory, right? The idea that the social project that he thinks is the liberatory project, right? The social project itself has limits on how broadly it can reach society. And in my own thinking, I think that he's limited by an economic imagination, in part, and in part a bias about human nature, that he just thinks that some people are just not capable of philosophy, but by virtue of their natures. And the other part of it is the economic limit, that what is necessary for the social reproduction, for us to be able to get up every day and have society continue moving, right? Some amount of non-philosophical work is required for that. And so there's a limit on who can engage in philosophy. And I want to say, well, any kind of ideal of liberation, it has to be at least possible in principle for everyone to be able to partake in it. If there's an internal limit to the theory, then that means it's not a good normative ideal. That's kind of where I want to go and what I want to defend. I mean, I hadn't thought about it as like a kind of epistemic or a difference in knowledge, right? I do think that the philosophical dialogues as Plato represents them, not knowing is not an obstacle. It's actually the conceit that you know things when you don't. That's the obstacle. And a lot of what Socrates does is break down people's sense that they know things and get them just to recognize that they're ignorant, right? That is a huge chunk of work, right? And then the next step after that is how do we pursue knowledge? And sometimes people do know things. In some of Plato's dialogues, there's more knowledgeable people around. But that inequality is never presented as a problem. Yeah.
We're going to have time for 2 more questions, and then we're going to enjoy some of the good food. So the two people who are up now are gonna go ahead and ask questions, and then we'll move the conversation over.
Okay.
Hi, thank you very much. I am not that attuned to this topic. Did I catch that slavery was accepted in the time?
Mm-hmm.
And would you not then consider that a cave also? In which case then, it's kind of related to a couple of the other questions previously. How does one get out of that? So, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think the thing I was trying to say at the end is that Plato has a sort of remarkable lack of interest in what it actually takes to get out of a condition of slavery. So he's not interested in the thing that Frederick Douglass is interested in that sense, right? And it's like I mean, it's to a certain extent a remarkable fact given the role that slavery plays in his theory as a metaphor for the soul's condition. Yeah, but I mean, I guess I don't have anything more to say than that. You might think that that's a reason to like criticize Plato. Yeah.
We'll have one last one after, and then we will move to the next phase. Thank you.
So you brought up the point about not thinking of it as sort of an epistemic problem. So a different way to come at it, so thinking about Hegel, and sort of the master-slave discussion that he brings up in phenomenology and everything. So there, the slave is achieving liberation, in a sense, not through thought, but I think through much more of a sense of like bodily power. It's the enslaved person's ability to labor and transform the world physically through bodily power that in a sense then provides the insight that perhaps that person can be fully human. And so I guess I'm just wondering, is that, if you could talk maybe a little bit more about the mind-body kind of split there, and maybe is that is there sort of an epistemic problem in terms of human, in terms of the liberation piece then? Because the knowledge is coming, in a sense, through the body in a way rather than through the mind.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. No, Hegel like lurks in the background here in a very 19th century German kind of philosopher way. I think that what you're describing is the Marxist critique of Hegel, and that is not in fact Hegel's view. Hegel's view is closer to Plato, which is that, I mean, it's not even Plato's. I mean, Hegel's view would be that the slave has a perspective on the relationship between the slave and the master that the master cannot have. And therefore, the slave has a type of awareness or consciousness that this master cannot have, and that is how the slave achieves liberation, is through this recognition, right, of their mutual dependence. And I think that is something that where that is missing in Plato is that Plato doesn't think that the slave's perspective on his enslavement is the kind of intellectual pursuit of avenue towards liberation. I take it that would be the Hegelian point, is if the slave's perspective on his liberation. Now, the mind-body thing, I think, is Marx's critique of Hegel, where Marx says, no, it's not recognition, it's labor. It's the slave's material production of the conditions of life. That's what makes the slave have access to something the master can't have access to, and it's not a mental access, it's a literal, productive, physical access, right? I mean, I take it to be that's Marx's critique, and that's again something that's missing in Plato. That perspective is the perspective on liberation. I think what I'm trying to say is that Plato is thinking about it from the perspective of the master and what form of life is enabled for the master by the slave, and that thing is going to be the pursuit. That's going to be the way that liberation is achieved. And I'm trying to develop that as like a critique of Plato. Yeah, but thank you. This is a really important question. Thank you.
We have one last question. Hello. Thank you for the lecture. Actually, what I wanted to ask steps upon what we have just discussed, because the taking a step back and viewing the big image is the whole this whole project about achieving freedom steps upon the duality between the physical, the body, and the spiritual, the mind, and your conclusion is that we can achieve that through rational training, through practicing philosophy, arriving to pure reason, and in turn in freedom. But we forget the different, the other side, of viewing how we can achieve to freedom through the physical body. And that is also, as far as I know, the debate between Plato and Aristotle, who focuses on the physical body. And this tradition of thought arrives through the less and revolutionary becoming to how we can achieve freedom through the physical body. The physical body itself is the means. So I would like to expand this point of view and including this perspective in the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. Right, I think that what I'm trying to say about the social practice idea is that there's a kind of relationality in the spiritual domain that you're talking about. And that relationality, how we relate to each other as rational creatures, is made possible in part through a bodily arrangement that it's both, we have to physically be present, we have to have our bodies be cared for such that we're capable, but all that makes the body a kind of enabling condition of the real means of liberation, which is what you're describing as the spiritual, right? And I want to say that it's interpersonal, and it's not merely internalizing. And I think that's an important distinction worth making, is that it's interpersonal and not merely internalizing. But the perspective that you're taking is also not one I think that Aristotle takes. I think Aristotle is pretty close to Plato on this, that you need to minimize the body as much as possible in order to allow for philosophical, not conversation, but contemplation. And that's the Aristotelian sort of alternative. And I think the perspective you're articulating is one that is many sort of more modern critical theorists want to take up. And my question is, how close to that does Plato get? And I'm trying to find like where the line is. I do think there's a line.
That wasn't the last question. We have one last one. Obviously, you stimulated a lot of discussion. So we have one last question over there, and then we really will move the conversation over.
I have a very brief question. After all the discussions we had, what are our take-home messages?
What are the take-home messages? Philosophy is a social practice, and that's how you get free. That's the take-home message.
And that's the place to end it. I paid them both to do that. Thank you so much. Thank you, John. This was incredible.
Katie.
Obviously, you've started a lot of conversation. Really quick, I have an important announcement about the bar. It is open till 9 o'clock, so make sure you get your drinks right away. And thank you all so much. If you are excited about this talk, the National Hellenic Museum is always looking for members. And you can find out how to become a member at the front desk. Thank you.